So for my presentation, we're going to be talking about mapping and cultural difference in Miller's. The cartographer tries to map the way to Zion. I'm not going to be, I should make a note, I'm not going to be trying to map out the entirety of the space, but rather talk about the cultural differences that come into play kind of within the article that I found, as well as within the poems themselves, and how that speaks to mapping. To kind of serve Miller as well as Harley at the same time, if that makes any sense. So we're just going to briefly cover a few moments of mapping within the piece, and then talk about the poems within the piece in terms of the context, and I'm sorry, in terms of the speaker and how the speakers in the cartographer and the Rastaman who try to map out the way, and the political power that comes into play between the two of them when it comes to knowledge and how to map a space. And a little bit of a side note, I will be either mentioning or adding lines of poetry in the chat that we're going to look at later on, but without other than that, let's get started, I guess. So in the article, it talks about the space of Zion in and of itself as a culturally historical landmark. Sorry, in that culturally it's meant to kind of represent the Caribbean people throughout time, and that's part of the reason why it's a little hard to define and why you have to map it in a certain way that you have to map it. In terms of mapping a space in general, you have to kind of move through it and experience it in order to fully understand and grasp the concept of mapping within the piece itself. In the article that I mentioned, in the article that I found, which is entitled "The Rhetoric Movement," the rhetoric of movement within. Wait, what is it? The rhetoric of movement and exploring the art of mapping in Miller's Cartographer Tries to Map the Way to Zion. Sorry, I didn't mention it earlier. We get the two cultural sides of things that come into play when mapping a space. In that, we get a Western view of how things should be mapped in the cartographer, and we get the more of the non-Western view and the more culturally sound view when you're trying to map Zion. In the sense of mapping as it is informed by the piece, the cartographer he's kind of limited by his knowledge of mapping, his cultural understanding of mapping, in terms of what he knows. So he has to kind of move through the space and experience the space in order to understand it. And the Rastaman is there as a kind of a pushback in order to get him to move through the space, and in order to kind of get him to understand the space better. In terms of the poems themselves and the cultural side of things, we see when it comes to mapping, we see the two different cultural perspectives when it comes to mapping, as well as some of the dangerous pitfalls that can occur when it comes to mapping a space. In the poems themselves, we'll be looking at the first and second poem, or what we will look at right now. The first and second poem of the cartographer tries to map Zion section, in terms of informing how each cultural side looks at mapping, as well as the 11th poem, which talks about some of the dangers in the political side of things that can happen in terms of mapping the space. So if you want, about halfway down the page in the first poem, the sentence starts as my job is to and it goes my job is to imagine the widening of an unfamiliar, and also the widening. My job is to imagine the widening of the unfamiliar and also the widening ache of it, to anticipate the ironic question, how did we find ourselves here? My job is to untangle the tangled and to worry the concerned, to guide you out from the cul-de-sacs into which you may have wrongly turned. And in the sense of a cultural way of mapping, the cartographer is kind of limited, culturally speaking, into what he views mapping as, in that he sees it as just a way to guide people around the town, but he doesn't consider some of the pitfalls that Harley suggests and that we'll see in the next poem in terms of mapping a space. So when it comes to the second poem on page 17, sorry for not mentioning the page number in the last one, in which the Rasta man disagrees. Third line down from the top, about second sentence in. So him work is to make thin and crushable all that is big, and as real as ourselves is to make that all that is to make flat all that is high, and rolling it is to make invisible the whatless plenty things and poor people see you do without, like broad houses and corner shop from which Miss K sell her famous peanut porridge. And then again, the map maker's work is to make visible all of them things that shoulda never exist in the first place, like the conquest of pirates, like borders, like the viral spread of government. So in terms of the cultural side of things in that poem, we get to see how a non-Western person will view a space, in that he sees things not as cut and clear as black and white. He knows the disagreements of mapping when it comes to a different culture mapping a space, and kind of what Harley suggests, and the similarities between them, in that when you map a space, how you map it and how you define it really depends on what your culture wants in the map. So you can change history, you can change all sorts of things that are important to that culture, but not important to you when it comes to mapping. And one instance of that we see here in the text can be seen on page 28 in the 11th poem of this section. I won't read the entire poem, but about in the second stanza, the third line of the second stanza, I will read a little bit from there and then towards the end. Lady Musgrave's road was laid in a serpentine way, so that Miss Musgrave, on her carriage ride home, would not have to see the Nagaman's property, so much bigger than her husband's own. She did not want to feel the carriage slow and know her driver had just then turned. And then it says, and then at the very close of the last stanza from the fourth line from the top, he says, he wonders if his map he made on our roads, he wonders if on his map he made our roads a little smoother, a little straighter, as if in drawing he might erase a small bit of history's disgrace. In terms of this poem, we kind of get a sense of the political power and knowledge that comes into play when mapping, or in specifically this instance when mapping Zion, in that just by looking at a road and by trying to map a road that is so culturally significant, in that it was designed for a woman who drove it specifically because she didn't want to look at a black man's property, how that can be erased, and how that cultural significance can be erased in that. It is important to understanding the history of the space, and it's important to understanding the space as a whole in culture, in the context of culture, and how that Western cultures might not deem that important and appropriate, and how that they control the knowledge of that, and that they can take that away, if that makes any sense. If you have any questions, please let me know. I mean, I will obviously be there. So, yeah. Bye.